Welcome to the Design Build Institute of America's Design Build Delivers podcast. I'm Kim Wright at DBIA's national headquarters. Our nation has been talking about the need for serious infrastructure investment for a generation. And even though it's an issue that draws support across the vast political divide, each year comes and goes without action. Could things be about to change? As we struggle with the COVID-19 economy and the need for stimulus, many point to infrastructure investment's long history of speeding economic recovery. So it seemed like the perfect time to talk to Norman Anderson, infrastructure expert and chairman and CEO of CGLA Infrastructure in Washington. Norman has worked on infrastructure issues for decades with leaders in both parties. So let's see if our coronavirus recovery might or might not impact the infrastructure debate. Norman, thank you so much for joining us. This is going to be a really interesting and I think important conversation about infrastructure, and something that certainly our DBIA folks are highly interested in and engaged in. But let's start at the beginning. Tell me a little about your firm and all the work that you've been doing over many years for in infrastructure world.
Sure. Nice to talk to you. And I started this firm actually 32 years ago. And the focus has always been on infrastructure. Originally, we worked globally, and then we started to work more in the U.S. about 15 years ago. And the focus is always on specific projects and trying to figure out how to make projects happen. So we've built a business model around public value creation in terms of getting infrastructure projects up and running. And one of the things we do is our leadership forum, where every year we'll identify the top 100 projects in North America and invite the owners of those projects to come and present to 500 plus people. And the whole idea there is to figure out how to make those projects go forward. It gives us a pretty good basis from which to figure out what works and what doesn't work.
You know, I think one of the hardest things when we talk about infrastructure is the really basic concept of what is infrastructure. I mean, everybody thinks roads and bridges, right? But if we're really talking about building up an infrastructure in this nation, we're talking about something that's far broader than that.
Yeah, we just sent a map over to the White House, a digital interactive map of 500 priority projects, and we used transportation's one category with all the subsectors, highways, bridges, transit, et cetera, but also energy, including oil and gas, generation, transmission, and distribution, renewable energy, et cetera. Water and wastewater, including also desalination, all sorts of, so for us, it's a very broad definition. Plus we go into digital infrastructure. So we talk about 5G, we talk about broadband, and then we talk about space as well. And then finally, and especially relevant right now, we include social infrastructure as part of the overall infrastructure definition. Right now, healthcare facilities, telemedicine, distance learning, all of that doesn't work without broadband. So, you know, we found that broadband is a huge theme all over the country. I was talking to a state senator from Ohio yesterday, big issue for him. The people in Nevada, huge issue for them as well, huge issue all over the country. How we help people, how we help everybody participate in the opportunities that the country creates. I mean, that's how we define infrastructure. It helps people participate in what we're doing. And so we use those 5 broad categories.
When, especially in this environment, broadband is probably never feels more important and real for folks than in the COVID world, for sure. So it's interesting that that's definitely getting people's attention finally, because there's been a long push.
Yeah, huge. And you know, one of the things you can do, we're looking at a highway in Ohio where we build a utilities corridor down the middle of it that would help to defray the cost of the highway, and it provides broadband access to people all along the highway. It's $1 billion project, so big deal.
Yeah, definitely. So let's, this is going to be a multi-layered conversation because the idea of our underinvestment in infrastructure is certainly not new. That's been going on for, decades and decades. Now we have the COVID situation layered on top. Then you've got the economic need for recovery, which of course I think most agree that infrastructure has a critical role to play there. So let's go back to the history. I mean, we as a people have inherited this, impressive, whether it be the Eisenhower highways or our digital footprint. We have a huge inheritance in infrastructure, and yet I think it's safe to say we've not really reinvested in that inheritance. It's pretty much been laying there unattended for a good long stretch of time. Where does that leave us now?
Well, that's a huge issue, right? And one of the things that we find interesting, and just to tie that into your last question, is you go to Capitol Hill and you talk to the people about infrastructure, and you have no idea what's happening in their brains, because especially the older people are thinking highways, bridges, and tunnels, and we've got to fix all this stuff. But you talk to the younger generation, and they're talking about electric vehicles, they're talking about renewable energy, and they're talking about battery storage, they're talking about anything that's green.
Right.
And you can really, I think we talked about this earlier, you can tie these things together, and it's a really interesting way to do it, because if you underinvest for long enough, you make yourself vulnerable to bad things happening. And you could argue that one of the big problems with COVID is our underinvestment over the last 30 or 40 years in healthcare infrastructure, in general healthcare infrastructure. I mean, the idea that 80% of our PPE comes from China, as somebody said, that's not just irresponsible, that's idiotic. That's idiotic, right?
Yeah.
And if you look at what we are underinvestment in infrastructure, look at the transmission grid, look at the gateway tunnel between New York and New Jersey. It's not, it's not going to be a black swan or an act of God that causes those things to go down, because we've allowed that to become so vulnerable. Maybe the dam you're talking about that was breached in Michigan 2 days ago. The Army Corps has 600 dams like that. The Department of the Interior has the same number of dams like that. So you underinvest for long enough, you have a problem. And then, just like most of the people in the world, I have a lot of young employees. They think we've underinvested in the planet, right? They think we've made us super vulnerable to global warming, et cetera. This becomes almost a religious issue with older people, but with younger people, it's a fact that the baby boomers took everything they wanted, generated a huge amount of debt. Now we're moving towards $30 trillion in debt, made government really small, and also abused the planet, right?
Yeah.
That's their perception of that generation. And so this issue about reinvesting in our infrastructure is a huge issue, but it's arguably it's an existential issue. I mean, it used to be, wouldn't it be nice? But now you've got all this infrastructure that you're talking about. The average age of the dams I'm talking about is 65 years old. Average age of some of our highways is older than that. And so we've got to figure out how to revitalize the old stuff and build the new stuff. And, in terms of our electricity transmission, imagine what our lives would have been like over the last 2 months if the electricity grid would have gone down, right? I mean, broadband, horrible to not have that. Electricity grid goes down, end of the world, right? Mass chaos. We haven't invested in, what's called the most complicated machine in the world in forever, and not nearly enough. And so a big piece here is, how do you get private investment into infrastructure, right? So we want to increase the amount of public investment for sure, but you've also got to figure out how to bring long-term investment from pension funds, life insurance funds, et cetera, into the discussion, help that money become innovative, because that's long-term, low-return funds, not too dissimilar from municipal bonds, a little more expensive.
Well, and that gets to the truism that has been so difficult with this issue, is that everyone says they support infrastructure investment, and yet when it comes time to actually put your money where your mouth is, it all comes to a grinding halt, because no one's really ready to dig in and come up with the cash to make it happen. does this COVID situation and our potential and our need for economic recovery complicate that or provide an opportunity, do you think?
Well, I think it's both. I mean, like this issue is a much, I don't think we talk about this issue right. So one of the things we've been doing since the beginning of the crisis is we've been doing surveys. And one of the surveys we did, we asked people, if infrastructure were a brand, is this a strong brand, a mediocre brand, or a weak brand? And we asked the infrastructure community that question, right? Strong, mediocre, weak. Nike's a strong brand. 94% of the infrastructure community said that the infrastructure brand is either mediocre or weak. Jeez. 94% of our community, right? So, walking around Capitol Hill with the infrastructure flag, which they probably don't know what you're really talking about anywhere. The water guys, the energy guys, the highway guys, right? And then them going, well, if I figure it out, they're still not getting it done for me, right? They're over budget. There is a huge public relations issue that needs to be addressed around the infrastructure issue. So that's one issue. The other issue we find when we do polling, and it's really interesting, we ask this question, what does infrastructure investment mean to you? And we ask that the public, right? And, I would think that they would say highways, bridges, and tunnels, airports, ports, et cetera. Highways, bridges, and tunnels gets a 4% response. Airports, ports, et cetera, gets a 2% response. Health gets 37%. Mobility gets 36%. So it's what does it mean for you, right? And that's another place in which talking to the beneficiaries and getting their testimonials is a big issue, and it's something that I think the industry's not doing nearly enough of. You'd love to see, let's say, a TV commercial that just talks to people about how much more quickly they get to the office, or how great it is to have clean water in the morning. That's what that is what infrastructure is. It's not a project, and it's not an investment. It's a thing that makes my life better and my kids healthy, right? That's what infrastructure is. The
real world touches that infrastructure has on our lives that I mean, let's be honest, in America particularly, we just take for granted because it's always been there.
Right. Yeah, it's always been there. What's really interesting is it hasn't necessarily always been there, right? I mean, there's, a whole generation of people who still didn't have, indoor plumbing, right?
Right.
And they're still alive, right?
Yeah.
And so that's a really interesting fact that you just said. But then there's other people who, unless they have broadband, they can't get their jobs done. They can't have a successful life, et cetera. So, it's a really broad conversation. It's a national conversation that I think we need to have. And we have to bring a lot more people into the discussion than just the infrastructure professionals, right? And that's what's really, really interesting. Since the beginning of this crisis, we're like everybody else. When somebody says, the way to fight this war is to go home and sit under your desk, you go, yeah, not so much, right? What can we actually do? And so we started to reach out to infrastructure professionals all over the country, state and local public officials, and say, what are your priority infrastructure projects? And we've identified 500 projects. They would create 2.4 million jobs. I just got off a call with the White House because they're interested in the idea, of course. They'd create 2.4 million jobs between now and the end of December. And those are jobs that would those are jobs that would exist in every single congressional district. We put the projects and where the people come from and where the manufacturing would come from on a map, and it covers every single congressional district. So all of a sudden, there's a really interesting conversation to have with everybody, because everybody's office you go into, you go, these are the jobs that you're not getting by not supporting infrastructure. And by the way, going back to your question, how you open this up, the COVID thing is a big problem now. It may have started as a small problem, but now we're 40 million people on unemployment in a country of 300 million, right? And unless there's a big bang very soon in terms of job creation, in terms of a fiscal jolt, that's what Chairman Powell was getting at 2 days ago in his testimony before Congress. Unless we have that, pretty soon, this recession is going to be very drawn out, right? I mean, people say it might turn into a depression. What I find important right now is that human beings don't adjust quickly, right? Most of us, our reference point is February, right? Mm-hmm. Hopefully this gets back to what February was like. Not going to happen, not going to reemploy 40 million people in a couple of months. What we have to make sure, and if you think about what happened with the Great Depression, Franklin Roosevelt didn't start to make his changes until 1933, 3.5 years after the stock market crashed.
Right.
So you've got to really get people up and running. And the only bullet in our gun is infrastructure investment. That's it. Everything else is everything else. Infrastructure investment would put people to work, would create jobs, would create opportunities. There's no other real good strategic way to get the economy up and running again.
Because there's a long history of infrastructure investment working successfully as recovery because it is so easy, right? It's relative, but can be implemented quickly.
Not only that, it puts lots of people and lots of different kinds of people to work quickly, right? I was just on a conversation with a friend of mine, and we were talking about, see if I can find the document here, probably can't find it. That's what happens when you're looking for things.
It's inevitable,
but look,
right?
It puts everybody together. It puts designers together, construction engineers. It puts project managers. It puts workers together. It puts lots of people together, plus manufacturing, right? And by the way, one of the things that is going to happen is that we're going to bring manufacturing production back to this hemisphere for sure, because you can't be that reliant on China and on Asia in general. So you've got to figure out how to do that here. And that's going to create all sorts of really important strategic infrastructure opportunities immediately.
And our industry especially has already been banging that drum. Supply chains have been an issue for a pretty good stretch here, and they have serious concerns about what it's going to be like if in fact we are successful in trying to get an infrastructure boom generated. It could all come to a grinding halt if you can't supply your projects.
Right. Yeah, we think that's the huge opportunity. That's our opportunity to be the most creative generation. Let's put it that way, right? I mean, this is that moment for this generation to figure out how to get everything going in the right direction again. And it's going to require a pretty significant investment. But look, the amount of money we've pumped into the economy, it's headed towards 30% of GDP as we're going. And a lot of that money hasn't been spent. So a lot of what we're doing is trying to figure out how to get that money into infrastructure. And, most of your members, when you mention the federal government is going to provide funding for XYZ, they go, oh my goodness, what are the strings going to be attached? What are those going to look like, right? This is a crisis. This is when we've got to get money into the infrastructure economy as soon as possible. And as a result, I think it's very clear that the people who have been incredibly conservative in the bureaucracy simply need to be unleashed, right? The leadership of our country needs to say, the number one priority is to create these jobs and get these projects moving. And like Chairman Powell said, it was Secretary Mnuchin said 2 days ago, we're going to take some losses. Well, we're going to take some losses on infrastructure investment, but there's a lot of money from the CARES Fund, first CARES Fund, about $20 billion, still in the States, still hasn't been used because it's supposed to be used directly on corona related issues, COVID related issues. Well, infrastructure, as far as I'm concerned, in terms of addressing the unemployment issue, is directly related to that. So that's one of the arguments we're making with people right now.
Okay. Well, and you make the point about the ability to get a diverse workforce engaged quickly in delivering the projects. And then there's also the back end of that is that when you complete that hospital or you complete that restaurant or the hotel or whatever you've completed, that then opens up the opportunity for jobs and expansion of whatever it is you just built and delivered in a community, which can have a huge impact.
No, it's fantastic. And the multiplier impact is giant. And what's really great is that, and you're talking about supply chain revitalization as well, reimagining the supply chain. What's really great is the long tail of an infrastructure project is 7x the initial capital cost of the project, right? So not only are you creating manufacturing jobs around the country to supply that asset, but you're creating jobs for the next 30 or 40 years. And somebody who's a manufacturer knows that, right? So they can actually ramp up, they can get bank loans, they can sleep at night because they know that those new projects up and running are going to be using their goods and services for the next 30 years. That's a big deal. That's a big deal. I mean, the other side of this story, what we've done over the last 40 years, let's say, underinvesting in infrastructure, it means that all our assets are past their use by date. And so we're spending all our time trying to fix stuff that should have been retired 10, 15, 20 years ago. That's a big deal. In 1956, 90% of what we spent on infrastructure was on new build, 10% was on O&M. Last year, it was 30% on new build and 70% on the long-term piece of O&M piece of it, right? Yeah. Big problem, and it's a problem everywhere.
To some degree, it's easier to define the problem than it is to have that magic wand that then makes the solution happen. Realistically, what do you think could be done in this environment, given all of the moving parts of which, COVID and an economic recession or worse, just complicates the issue? And it's an election year, no small thing either. Realistically, is there still a little window here that can be navigated that would allow something to move in this environment, do you think?
So, I'm not the guy who wants to sell nonsense. And I think the chance that we get a bipartisan infrastructure stimulus between now and the election is exactly zero.
Okay. That's kind of what I was going for. I was wondering if you'd go there.
Yeah, no, it's wrong to tell people something that's not the truth on such an important issue. But that's why I mentioned that there is plenty of money. And, the Fed has said that they will spend as much money as it takes for a fiscal stimulus to keep this economy from going into a depression. And that's really what we're talking about right now. That's what needs to happen. And so if you look at the way this is set up, there's at least $100 billion in Department of Transportation, in EPA, in other agencies that could go into infrastructure pretty quickly. TIFIA has a lot of money, RIF has a lot of money, et cetera. That's one thing that's important. As I mentioned, there's at least $20 billion from, and probably more from CARES 1 that could go into infrastructure. But the big issue is that the Fed will buy paper, right? And the Fed's talked about buying paper from states and municipalities. Well, the Fed ought to buy paper that goes right into infrastructure investment. That's really important. And we think that they can do two things immediately: buy paper from state infrastructure banks and really rev those up. We've got these existing underperforming institutions that could immediately invest in projects. And then the other thing is we've got obviously local authorities, the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, Orange County, et cetera, that ought to be selling their paper to the Fed. The Fed ought to be buying their paper so that they don't cancel projects. I just got off the phone with the director of a large infrastructure company who said, we're starting to see cancellations. Well, of course he's starting to see cancellations because there's no money. The vehicle miles traveled in Ohio in April were 55% of what they were. Nothing like the 2008 thing. This is way worse than 2008. So, our job, your job, my job is to get the Fed, I think, to put money into infrastructure around the country to save those jobs from the cancellations that are starting to happen, and to figure out how to get the different agencies to start to rev up some of the plans they have so that we can create new jobs. Again, we've identified 500 projects ready to go. They can create jobs, as many as 2.4 million jobs. That's a big deal. We've just got to do it.
Right. Well, and it's interesting that you've mentioned the state infrastructure banks too. I don't think most people realize that that's even a thing, and that has potential to help, break it open a little bit too.
Yeah, it's really interesting because there's at least two different kinds of people in the world, right? There's the people who will tell you why things aren't possible, and there's the people who see an open canvas that they can paint on. Right now, everything's an open canvas that you can paint on, right? State infrastructure banks, oh, we can't do this, we can't accept this kind of money, we can't use the money for that. Doesn't make any sense during a crisis, right?
Right.
The White House can wave a magic wand, and all of a sudden those state infrastructure banks can do a lot of things that they need to be able to do. They can invest in things that are non-transportation related. They can also accept funding, not just from the Fed, not just from paper, but they can also accept funding from pension funds. They can also accept funding from sovereign wealth funds overseas. And they ought to be able to accept money from you and me, right? I mean, because if you think about it, if you have a little bit of money right now, what in the world would you do with that money? Well, why don't you put it in state infrastructure bonds to build projects that are going to benefit your company? So there's a lot of creative things that we should be doing right now that we're not doing because we're still frozen, right? We're still in this debate. You turn on the TV. My wife thinks that I think TV is participatory, right? So I work out in the morning and I'm yelling and screaming at the different channels that I'm watching, right? Because they don't make any sense, right? A journalist talking to a journalist about COVID is a waste of time because none of them ever studied science, right?
Right.
So they're ridiculous listening to those people. But one of the big issues is that's all they're talking about. Should we open? Should we not open? Da 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 da. Let's do a two-track conversation. There's the COVID issue, and then there's the economic issue that unless we get this going, right, unless we make investment happen right now, right, we're in for a world of pain because history shows that, right? History shows that, and I think Secretary Mnuchin and Chairman Powell are very clear about that. They're not Churchillian, right? They're not saying, blood, sweat, and tears or whatever Churchill said. They're saying we're concerned about the future. We have as much money as it takes for a fiscal stimulus. That's the same thing. It's just a different way of helping people. Well, it's not. Let me disagree with myself. It's not the same thing, right? Because Churchill made it very clear. This isn't going to be a lot of fun for a long period of time. We're still in this weird gray zone where people go, it might not be as bad. No, it is going to be as bad. So let's figure out how to make big investments right now because that's absolutely critical.
So, the design build community has a long history because, the projects we deliver tend to be, they are very collaborative. They tend to be therefore more innovative. They can maximize your budget. We are well suited and well outfitted to help deliver and have in the past recovery. So our folks are chomping at the bit, and yet they're just kind of on the sidelines waiting for that next thing to happen. When is this going to be triggered so that we can put them to work? So I'm wondering if for those who are sitting here listening going, yeah, I know this is all true, but what can I do about it? How do they engage in a meaningful way on something like this?
I mean, I think there's a couple of things. One of the things is we like to do this survey work because it teaches us things that, we might not otherwise know. And then all of a sudden we know it. That's right. The nice thing about a survey. It turns out that the infrastructure community doesn't think the federal government matters that much in infrastructure and doesn't think the Congress matters that much in infrastructure. They think their governors matter. I think it would be tremendously valuable for your members And, we'd love to work with you, but that's up to you guys. But for your members to make it very clear to the governors of their states, two things: which projects really are ready to go right now that will yield long-term benefits. So ready to go, we can create jobs. These will create long-term benefits, right?
Yeah.
That's really important. And, the other thing that people forget is that in the infrastructure business, 84% of the employees are small businesses because there's so much subcontracting, right? So that's another buzzword that really gets people's attention. So make sure that the governors have a list of projects, because I don't know that anybody realizes that they don't. They know governors do, right? And you've got to figure out how to prioritize, right? What are the top 10 projects? And then call the White House, right? And call the White House and make it very clear, here are 10 projects. This is what it's going to cost. This is what we're going to give you back in terms of job creation. And we need this right now. Very specific. The general stuff, nobody at the White House knows what to do with that, right?
Yeah.
The specific stuff they do. And we can work with you guys by putting these projects on our map and actually helping people see where jobs are going to be created, what kind of jobs, when, et cetera. Make it as tactile, as physical, as visual as possible. This idea of pictures worth 1,000 words. Well, in infrastructure, it's worth 1,000,000 words, 1 bazillion words, right? I like to tell the people who work with me or for me that the average human being can hold in their brain about 150 people, right? That's about how many people, if I made you walk through the names of the people you'd have in your brain.
Yeah.
The average human being, how many infrastructure projects to some level of detail do you think they can hold in their brain? Maybe 10, right? Maybe 10. How many do you think somebody in the White House, who's not actually an infrastructure expert, Larry Kudlow, can hold in his brain, right? Maybe a half, right? So you need real tools to help these guys see it, reference it, and make decisions. Those are the things that are unbelievably important. So I think, sorry for going on in terms of this answer, but I think it's really important to figure out real projects that are going to do two things: create long-term economic value, not the shovel-ready sidewalk stuff, long-term economic value, and are ready to create jobs now. It doesn't have to be a construction worker's job. It can be a design job. It has to create work now. We have to put people back to work, right? Get those projects to the governor's office. Make sure that the governor has a person who's prioritizing that list of projects, and then make that call to the White House and hopefully get that project. And we can work with DBIA on that to get those projects on our map so that this is something that people can see and understand that you can measure it and it matters. So we can start to put people to work.
Making it real. Really helping people understand what it is, other than that broad conversation we have about infrastructure.
Exactly. That's exactly what needs to happen.
Well, Norman, thank you so much for this. This is terrific. It's an issue that is dear to the heart of our industry for sure. And everybody's looking for that way to make it happen, right? So. Yeah,
absolutely. And I think we can do it. So let's figure out how to work together and make something. Because we only have about, we got to get this thing up and running about a month and a half, right? We really have to get this moving in the next 45 days. So, now it's sort of a now or never moment.
All right. Well, thank you so much for that. That is perfect.
Thank you for your time. Appreciate it.
DBIA continues to advocate for infrastructure investment on Capitol Hill and the White House. We know that design build will play a vital role in helping our nation recover from the economic impacts we've seen with this pandemic, and we urge our legislative leaders to help fuel that recovery with infrastructure stimulus. We hope you'll join DBIA in October, where we'll talk about design build's role in our economic recovery and how teams can best navigate our new COVID-19 world. Our event will be in person and virtual on October 28th through 30th at National Harbor, just outside Washington, D.C. We hope to see you there. For more information, go to dbia.org/conferences.